Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. This week on the show, we're going to take our lens to look a little bit deeper at the impact of food on global health. And while it may seem like a bit of an unseemly topic, it's so important to health. And this has to do with access to clean water and sanitation and the global incidence of diarrhea. Our guest this week is a medical anthropologist, Dr. Rachel Hall Clifford. She's an associate professor in the Center for the Study of Human Health and the Departments of Sociology and Global Health at Emory University here in Atlanta, Georgia. She applies social science approaches to global health research and implementation. Rachel has conducted fieldwork in the Central Highlands of Guatemala on the delivery of health services for more than 15 years. She leads the Emory Co Design Lab for Health Equity, which centers on community led design and implementation of global health programs. She's the winner of the 2023 Jeffrey Copeland Global Health Award and is the author of Underbelly: Childhood Diarrhea and Hidden Local Realities of Global Health, which was published by MIT Press just this year. So, thanks so much, Rachel, for coming on the show. It's great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me, Kathy. I'm always excited to get into it and talk a little bit about diarrheal disease, that least glamorous of global health problems. But it's so interconnected with our lives and our food systems and how we eat that I think it's a really neglected issue.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we should all care about diarrhea. I think it's something we don't think about unless we're personally dealing with it. But tell us a little bit about what impact diarrhea has, especially on children in different parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right that we don't spend a lot of our time here in the US and in other high income countries thinking about the impact of diarrheal disease. In fact, I feel like it's big news when there's an outbreak. Like some of us have heard and been following recently the E. coli outbreak in McDonald's Big Mac, right? And this is
Hmm.
kind of headline news here. And while I followed that outbreak with interest, I was also thinking, oh, well, for the context that I work in global health in Guatemala, 98% of our water sources in Guatemala are infected with E. coli. This is just everyday life. It's not headline news. And so I think that huge disparity in terms of safety of food supply and water sources is huge. So it's incredibly rare for us to be sick with diarrhea in the US and very, very rare for a diarrheal illness to result in like severe outcomes or death. But unfortunately, when we look at the global landscape, that's just not the case. In fact, diarrheal disease remains in the top five at causes of death of children under five globally. So it's this really significant disease burden that children face.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible point. When we think of all the things that we may take for granted in the United States or in Europe, access to clean water is something I think that many of us just don't give a second thought to. It's just there, it's available, it's easily accessible. We don't have to walk for a long distance to access water. It's available in our homes, in our places of business, in our shops. Um, but that's not the case in many places, including Guatemala. Tell us a little bit more about the challenges or the difficulties in accessing clean water.
Yeah. So, some of the issues that you touched on are not having water available, everywhere that you go, especially within home. Guatemala actually was one of the countries that did very well on what were known as the Millennium Development Goals to advance global health and development, specifically surrounding water quality. So we have improved access of piped water into homes, but oftentimes that piped water is untreated.
Hmm.
And so while, the burden on, in particular, women for and children for walking and carrying water to home has been reduced. In some instances, I've actually seen diarrheal disease increase in those communities because folks are making the very logical kind of conclusion that, oh, it's coming out of this very modern tap. It must be clean water. And, the truth is that the infrastructure to maintain safe municipal water supplies is just simply not there. And then we get this really significant element of repeated exposure for the health of children. It's a huge disparity. On average, children in the US experience one bout of diarrhea per year when they're like 5 years old. And in Guatemala, they experience a bout of diarrhea every month. And so, that really shapes growth and development, and it impacts ability to absorb food. And so we see significant patterns of growth stunting resulting from the constant onslaught of diarrheal pathogens in the water.
Yeah, in your book, you write about this concept of malnutrition, infection, immunity cycling. Can you provide a little bit more background on what that means? Like, how does diarrhea tie into immunity or to malnutrition? How does it all come together?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an idea of malnutrition infection immunity complex. It's something that was first coined by anthropologist Barry Bogan, and it refers to the fact that when children, experience a bout of diarrheal disease, the energy that their bodies would put into growth is diverted to fighting that infection. And so normally, again, if this was a rare occurrence, it wouldn't really matter. There would be catch up growth and children would move on. But when children are constantly exposed to diarrheal pathogens, they get locked in this cycle where growth is diverted. It also weakens their immune system through repeated exposures, and that leaves them vulnerable to new infections. And so we see children getting trapped into these cycles. Um, the population where I work in Highlands, Guatemala is largely indigenous Maya, and 70% of that population face frozen. So it's incredibly pronounced. And one thing that always sticks out in my mind, especially as an anthropologist, is the fact that the indigenous Maya population were taller at the time of conquest, like 500 years ago, than they are on average. And so, I think it's this real embodiment of social exclusion that, they don't have access to economic means and to food. And then that's further compounded by, stunting due to diarrheal disease and other factors.
Wow. I'm wondering about the practicalities of accessing clean water. Many years ago, I was doing some field research in the Peruvian Amazon. And one of the things that I noted while I was there were that children suffered from chronic helminthic infection because it was common practice to drink raw river water without treat with boiling it or adding any kind of treatments to clean the water. And I'm wondering, do helminths also play a role here? And what are the means that could be used by communities to further improve their water quality? I mean, is it would they just need to boil the water, and is that also accessible based on access to fuel and firewood?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, of course, diarrhea really refers to a complex category of disease that's caused by lots of different things. So in Guatemala, we see the highest burden from E. coli, which is, of course, a bacterial pathogen, and rotavirus, which is viral. But there's a whole host of other pathogens, including helminths and other amoebas that cause illness. So, water purification is the name of the game and getting safe water supply. It's been really interesting over the long time that I've worked in Guatemala to see kind of various efforts to promote clean water sort of come and go. It's a landscape where there's a lot of foreign aid from big international organizations to sort of like mom and pop NGOs to local government efforts as well. And I actually see that sometimes those very good intentions make things worse. Um, I will never forget, I was sitting on the patio, at a house that I lived with a family who have become very good friends. And, my friend Juana all of a sudden said, there's no proven way to purify water. And this is like a very smart, thoughtful person. And like, well, okay, tell me more about this. Like, what's going on? And she proceeded to tell me that over the 2 years prior to my moving to the village, that three different efforts had been kind of launched in the village to teach about like water purification. The first one was a group of the small North American NGOs, a group of gringos that taught the community put water into empty plastic soda bottles and to put them up on the roof of their home. They have like 10 metal sheeting roof,
Mhm.
and the sun would, kill pathogens in the water. And so I'm 5'2", and the women in the household are significantly shorter than me. And they were laughing and saying, like, can you imagine us trying to get all of our drinking water up on the roof and then like get it back down again to heatings for cooking and drink and to give to our kids? So they were laughing about that one. And then there was another group that was from the Guatemalan government that was advocating drop of chlorine, so bleach into the water, which of course also works. But if you've ever had a drink of pool water, you know that that does not taste good. So, it's really unappealing for people to use. And then an international NGO had promoted um, boiling of water, which you mentioned some of the challenges there, Cassie, with, it's labor intense. It requires either the money to buy wood or the ability to chop down enough wood to do all of that extra broiling. And so none of these efforts had really caught on in the village, but it also led my very smart friend Juana to conclude, like, you know what, this is all sort of theories because all of these groups had come in and they had no knowledge of the prior efforts in the community of, um, what sanitation and hygiene trainings had taken place. So they taught them different things, and she was like, "Oh, it's all sort of theoretical, like, nothing really works anyway." So no one was really doing anything. And so I think that that was, a logical but really unfortunate takeaway for her.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the practicality and reality of mixed messaging and well-intentioned efforts, um, yeah, that just aren't going to translate across the board.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and this leads me to another line of questions because so this is on the purification side, but we know that another area where a lot of NGOs have been active is in the introduction of oral rehydration therapy um, to, save lives of children that are experiencing severe diarrhea. I think this really began in response to cholera outbreaks, right?
That's right. So oral rehydration therapy was first invented in 1969 to respond to cholera outbreaks in Bangladesh. So there was a team of Bangladeshi doctors that were supported by two Harvard docs, including Richard Cash, one of my dissertation advisors, who really first developed oral rehydration therapy. And this was kind of an effort to prevent death from diarrhea due to dehydration that wouldn't require IV therapy. Like cholera had always been exclusively treated with intravenous fluid previously. So oral rehydration for us is, it's Pedialyte. It's, really simply a solution of water mixed with salt, sugar, it's electrolyte.
Okay.
Those electrolytes are necessary because they help the small intestine absorb fluid during a bout of diarrhea. The small intestine gets very inflamed. The endothelial lining doesn't absorb like it normally does. And so those electrolytes help transport the molecules of water across that inflamed intestinal lining, if you will, which is why oral rehydration therapy is much better than just drinking regular water during diarrhea.
That makes sense. So, when it comes to this, is this something that's dispensed solely in hospitals, or are there efforts to bring oral rehydration therapy to communities? And is this another case of it being practical, or is there an access or implementation issue there as well?
Yeah, there have been huge efforts in global health since about the 1980s, and a bit even earlier to bring oral rehydration therapy to communities. The World Health Organization and then other UN agencies, including UNICEF and the World Food Program, have really promoted oral rehydration therapy largely through powdered packets. They come in sort of like a ketchup packet style thing. It's powder in there, and you mix it with a liter of water. I think that we've really focused as a field on those packets because it's quantifiable. They can be manufactured in, hubs. They're optimized for the best kind of current WHO formula for oral rehydration therapy. And there's been huge successes, like while diarrheal morbidity and mortality remain high, like the curve goes way down since the late 70s. And so that's really excellent. But I think it had some drawbacks in relying on these manufactured products because then, you're reliant on a supply chain. You're reliant on, things moving out from urban centers where they may be stored or produced out to rural communities who often face the biggest burden of diarrheal disease. And I think that that's introduced really significant challenges. The World Health Organization does also promote homemade solutions, but I feel like those have been less commonly advocated, and they've been a part of my interventional work because you think, man, it's so much easier, especially as a parent, to be able to give a sick kid something that you already have in your home that you can mix together with a little bit of sugar and a pinch of salt that you might have on hand, instead of having to, traipse out to a health center or a pharmacy. Yeah. Thing. Yeah.
So is it pretty simple to make then, Rachel? I mean, is this something that's been messaged to some of the mothers in Guatemala?
Yeah. It's really interesting. It can be so simple to make. You can use water, salt, and sugar. And it's recommended to have a squeeze of lime or other citrus in there as well. But you can also use the fluid. You know how if you're boiling a pot of rice or even plantains, it kind of creates some sort of cloudy water at first.
Yeah.
If you skim that off, that actually has a really optimal mix of electrolytes that can be very well absorbed in the gut. So that's a really effective oral rehydration solution. And, it can be made by the cooking of staple foods in most homes globally. But I think it's just the education and promotion of that method hasn't been used very much. So in a field trial that I was doing a few years ago in Guatemala, we introduced, homemade solutions. And by the end of the 2-year trial, it was by far the most popular oral rehydration in the study area. And so I think that that shows that, you know, it takes a little longer to do a training that isn't something tidy and manufactured, but it's worth it because people really recognize the value of that and are able to sustain use in their home.
Well, and I could see another advantage if you're using, the water from boiling rice or the water from boiling plantains, you're getting not only the starches, but you're actually getting clean boiled water. Be-
Exactly.
if you're mixing in salt and sugar with already contaminated water, is that really going to help the case? Um,
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's one of the big challenges that we face.
yeah. Well, I can't not ask this question as someone fascinated with medicinal plants. Did you come across in your studies any local remedies that local Maya women might have in their you know repertoire of medicines for their children? Like, are they also using medicinal teas to help with diarrhea, or is has that ever been explored as a more culturally salient way of dealing with this problem before in Guatemala?
I'm so glad you asked this. Yes, absolutely. So traditional healing, especially for the treatment of childhood illnesses, is super common. I have to make the sort of distinction that in all of my nearly 20 years now of working in um, indigenous communities in Guatemala, people do not refuse biomedical care in favor of traditional healing practices or herbal practices, but they usually do them alongside one another, which is really fascinating and wonderful. I think sometimes the indigenous communities in Guatemala and beyond sort of get blamed for not using biomedical services because they're, deferring to traditional practices. And it's not the case. We get that's really kind of rich to, a both and rather than an either
Mhm.
or. And for childhood diarrheal disease, home remedies are really widely used. I got to train with a traditional curandera in a rural community, and she grows a garden of like herbs and plants that she'll use. She makes a lot of um, kind of distinctions between types of diarrheal disease and what their causes are, whether it's evil eye or from like overheating, etc. Most of those treatments involve putting a poultice on the child. A lot of times it's um, chamomile, sometimes rosemary, and several other plants, depending on what the cause is. And they'll put them in sometimes in oil in a poultice on the child's stomach and then wrap fabric around it. Same for, putting especially, like the green leaves of chamomile under like a woolly hat and in the child's socks because it's thought that that would, draw the heat out from the body. Sometimes the chamomile, and other herbs are also used to make tea for the child to ingest, but, poultices are most common for kind of soothing, stomach,
Gently
trouble.
cramping. Yeah.
Exactly. Sometimes there's traditional massage that accompanies that, but I love the, the healer that I trained with. She, will talk with a parent, typically a mother, do a poultice, and then say, "Yeah, if your kid is not better tomorrow, you need to take them to the health post for oral rehydration." And so, it's kind of that mixture of like tradition and, um, healing that's based on tradition with, an acknowledgement of oral rehydration and other biomedical treatment.
Incredible. Well, I think too, sometimes there are interesting discoveries to be had with some of those medicinal plants that just haven't been discovered yet. 20 years ago when I was working in the Amazon, again, I was very interested in child health back then. I mean, I still am, but that was like my drive for my research there at the time. And one of the plants that local healers were using and also mothers were using was a plant they called sangre di grado or sangre di drago, which is like the dragon's blood tree. And so when you cut into this tree, it weeps this red resin that can then be consumed to help deal with they used it for hemorrhaging, but also like postpartum hemorrhaging, but also for diarrhea. Now, fast forward a couple of decades, and it turns out that that very same plant became the source of a drug that was later approved by the FDA to treat non-infectious diarrhea, and it acts on kind of the barriers in the gut that lead to water loss. And I just
Mhm.
found that to be such a fascinating path because at the time, we had no understanding of like, did this work? How does it work? What's the purpose? Why this tree? So I just wonder how
I
many
love
more
it.
stories like that might be
Yes.
out there,
And
that
there's
we just haven't studied yet.
there's so many ways of knowing. And I think that, that's so fantastic. One treatment that really stands out in my mind, which I feel like there's stories of this that sort of circulate with travelers, et cetera. But, if you have some particular types of helmets, they can be very difficult to get rid. Even pharmacologically, it can be hard to destroy them and very tough on them to take medications for something. Uh, the curandera that I worked with will sometimes poke helmets out either of the mouth or the anus with strong smelling herbs anointed in oil and
Wow.
coil them on a like a stick. And she's so careful to not break the the worm as it's exiting the body because,
Mhm.
obviously that would lead to
More
regeneration.
problems.
So, it's
Yeah.
like technique that I think um, you know, we don't really have in the US. We don't face those challenges, right? But it's really can be effectively done sometimes by traditional healers. So yeah, but
That's incredible and also terrifying to imagine, like, a worm that big that you're, like, coaxing out and wrapping it around a stick as
correct.
it's being pulled
Yeah.
out of the body.
Like,
Right.
do not recommend 0 out of 10. Like,
It's one of those, extra passengers you don't wanna bring home with you when you're
yeah.
traveling. Yeah. Um, well, I wanted to also dive a little bit deeper into issues regarding gender disparities and health inequities. I know that you've written a bit about like how oral rehydration therapy is rolled out. What can you tell us about the role of women, the responsibilities and even burden of blame on female caregivers in Guatemala? I'm sure this applies to many other countries as well, but I'm really curious about the gendered component to this.
Absolutely. So Guatemala is a very traditional and patriarchal society, like at its core, and women are really seen as the caregivers of children. So, in that capacity, they are the targets of all of the public health messaging around diarrheal disease and around, household sanitation, around water quality within household, et cetera. And, that really poses this huge burden on women because they are tasked with household, cleaning, maintenance, child caregiving, but they're often not in control of household finances. There's often a husband or a mother-in-law who are making decisions about kind of resources in the household, what's done in the household. So there's kind of creation of tension and conflict there when new ideas and new messages are introduced. And it's really women as mothers that kind of bear the brunt of, and, I think it's a sort of sad, dark side to a lot of the water sanitation and hygiene messaging that's been very intensively done over the last 30 years now in rural Guatemala that, like, the messages have penetrated. I can be speaking to, an even older woman in a very remote village up in the mountains. And, she'll say to me terms that are like from germ theory, ideas of, germs and dirt and transmission of disease. Um, so I think in that sense, wow, what a global health success. These messages have really penetrated. But I think the materiality of life, the infrastructure, the means to implement those messages is still so incredibly limited that there's this sort of disjuncture. But all of these trainings have essentially led people to believe and understand, like, oh, well, your kids get diarrhea if the house is dirty. The kids get diarrhea if
Oh,
you're dirty. And so it becomes this kind of socially stigmatizing thing. There are, interestingly, some socially acceptable times for your child to get diarrhea. Often at milestones like weaning from breastfeeding and learning to walk,
mhm.
kind of expected that children will get diarrhea. And there's seasons of the year, like especially at the start of the rainy season, when it's like more. But if your kid is frequently getting diarrhea or gets diarrhea outside of those kind of socially acceptable times, people talk about, oh, well, Rachel's kids have diarrhea because her house is not very clean. And I think that that really creates the double burden on women to actually try to implement all of the essentially impossible messages that they receive from global health intervention because of their, lived environment. But then it also creates stigma within the community when their kids are sick. And so, that obviously really impacts women and create greater workload on them. But I also think that it leads to delays in treatment seeking outside of the household for childhood diarrheal disease because it's like you kind of want to keep a lid on it unless you have
Yeah.
to let people know. Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
No, I mean, as you speak, Rachel, I think like what's really evident to me is that this medical anthropology approach of having a closer insights into the lived experience of the peoples that you're working with really adds this incredible depth of understanding and practicality to implementation of global health pursuits. Because I see this all the time in the nonprofit world, especially if students that go on to join them. There's this idea of kind of helicoptering in and doing some great good for a community without actually understanding what the actual needs of the community are and what's practical, what's necessary, what will remain sustainable within the community. And I think this is such a clear example of that. Like, you have to understand what the reality of life on the ground is like, in order to really be effective.
Absolutely. Sometimes good intentions lead to bad outcomes. And yeah, it's really been incredible to get to spend so long over such a long period of time learning from and with, communities to understand some of these challenges.
Yeah. Well, the last point I want to focus on are kind of health safety nets. So, what are the safety nets when it comes to child health and dealing with clean water issues? Like, what are the tools that you see as being accessible or available at this point? And, what's your vision? Like, where would you like to see things go?
Absolutely. I think that, we have on paper an outstanding health system in Guatemala. Guatemala affirms the human right to health and extends health services to everyone in the country. The challenge is always in the delivery. So I think we're starting to see a little bit of a sea change with the new presidential administration that I think is incredibly committed to the protection of health for all. And so I'm very hopeful that in coming years we'll see continued expansion of health services to rural communities and meant of those services because I do think that, being able to take your kid for healthcare is just baseline what all of us as parents need. I've had so many women tell me over the years, like, Rachel, I've heard that rich people take their kids to the doctor even when they're not sick. Have you heard? And I'm like, I have, yes. And so, the fact that that's like a flight of fancy for these
Hmm.
populations, I think point to both, a lack, but also this incredible opportunity for extending that safety net, both in times of illness, but also really the promotion of wellness. Yeah, so I now only work using a co-design model with communities in Guatemala and beyond as I work in global health. So this means that we center community identified challenges and have community facilitated solutions. So for me, that really helps communities build their own safety net and build their own priorities. One project that I'm very excited about right now, in terms of water quality, is I've been working to co-design a very low cost microscope for community use to test for E. coli in water supplies. So it's been an incredible team effort between our lab here at Emory, a couple of labs, and a community organization in Guatemala, and then partner labs at other universities. And our prototype is a very low cost, like you can make it with about $20, taking apart a webcam and a laser pointer. And then just a regular person in the community can grab a water sample, put it on the microscope, grab an image with a phone or a tablet, and then an AI algorithm uses object detection to check for the presence of E. coli. So I'm very excited and hopeful that this is going to help do two things. First is promotion of helpful water purification measures. We're partnered with a water filtration social enterprise, but then also kind of beyond that, promote community advocacy for water quality so that there's pressure applied to the government to actually improve municipal water supply. And what hopefully, this challenge and it's finally taken away, from communities.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, that was another question I had. Like, I don't know much about water purification, but I'm wondering, is there any kind of low cost? I'm thinking like a barrel filtration system that could be deployed just because these other systems seem to be so high labor intensive and just non-tenable with the flavor that chlorine adds or the heat issue with the roof. I mean, like, if it were me and I'm dealing with, like, raising a house full of kids and, like, cooking and doing everything I need to do with the garden and whatnot, it's be great if there was just a system that you could just pull from the tap and know that it's already gone through some sort of sand filter. I don't know what the filtration is, but is there something like that? Yeah.
Exactly. So one of my favorite solutions in this area is from social enterprise called Filtro. It uses technology that was created in Guatemala, but is like open source. The patent was donated to the world by its
Great.
inventor, and it uses local clays and basically it looks like a flower pot, but then it's fired to create an urban filter inside it. So it's incredibly low cost, low environmental impact, and then that filter is itself set inside a kind of container like that. And that's been incredibly successful. They're a social enterprise in the sense that they charge higher costs in urban markets for like fancier containers, and those costs are then used to offset pricing in poorer and rural markets. So I think that, solutions like that one that, are really sustainable and easy to use in households where you don't have to be taking on a lot of extra labor. You just put the water in and the clean water comes out, for like the way forward, at least for the time being until we can get our green full water supplies up and running.
It's amazing. Yeah, that's definitely would be my vote for if I were trying to do this, in a community. So, I know you have some exciting things coming up, Rachel. The book was released this year in English, but I heard that maybe it's coming out in another language soon. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I'm very excited in the spirit of co-design to be able to share this work with communities and colleagues in Guatemala and beyond. So the Spanish language edition will also be open access. It is launching in January at an event hosted at the U.S. Embassy through the Ministry of Health in Guatemala. So I'm very excited to be a small part of, getting to throw some light on some of these challenges of diarrheal disease and water quality in the country and with my colleagues who help support this work.
Amazing. Well, I'm so excited for you. That's great. And can you share with our listeners where you mentioned that the book is also available open access? It's also available in print. Where can they go to find the book if they'd like to learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. It's available on all major booksellers. The English language edition works like this. If you go to the MIT Press website, you'll see a tab that says open access and you can get the free e-read version.
Amazing. That's fantastic, Rachel. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was really enlightening, and I learned a lot. I mean, this is the other side of food and water, so it's important we understand all ends of the food chain. So, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded for you today on Squadcast. I want to thank our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for putting on a great show for you. And thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in each and every week. If you'd like to find the video version of this episode, you can head over to the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel, or you can find our links also to some pretty awesome swag, and lots of our former seasons are available on our website at foodiepharmacology.com. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and we'll see you next time.